What color pen does the orange show up, or only the black?
Black probably shows up better.
Black is fading rapidly. Okay. All righty. So, the purpose of today is to give you the intensity information that you need to use in your physical activity log in class. All right? So if you've read the guidelines closely, you're required to add up the minutes that you've done at moderate and vigorous intensity. Well, then you would have to be able to identify moderate and vigorous intensity. It can't be your opinion, because that doesn't count. Okay? So it has to use a proper measure, and I want you to concentrate on using a physiological measure. So I'll show you some other ones as well, today, but I want you to concentrate on the physiological ones because they're the ones that are the most accurate. All right? So our first physiological measure is using max heart rate, right? And max heart rate has a linear relationship with, not max heart rate, sorry, heart rate has a linear relationship with VO2, which is oxygen consumption. And VO2 is a very good measure, a percentage VO2 for intensity, but you have to have special equipment to measure that. So it's more a lab measure right now. We don't have a mini VO2 cart that you can strap on and run with. Okay, so a true VO2 measure would be a laboratory measure, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to look at that with Dr. Barlow later in the semester. All right, so heart rate, then, first thing we've got to do is work out what our max heart rate is. All right, and again, to do that really accurately requires a lab test, but we have some estimations that we can use. The very simple one is 220 minus your age. Right? It's pretty rough, but it's nice and quick and easy to do in your head. So depends who you're working with on whether you want to use 220 minus your age. If you're a personal trainer and you're working with someone that wants to get in shape, then that calculation is just fine, right? But if you're going to be working with athletes, someone who is looking to try to maybe beat their personal best in a 5K race or something like that, then you might want to use one that's a little more accurate. There are several different versions out there. The one in our textbook is 207 minus 0.7 times your age, which most of us can't do in our head and takes a calculator, right? So there's also one out there that is a 208 minus something times your age, right? There are several different versions of these, and they're generally considered to be more accurate than the 220 minus your age, right? So for example, if your person is 20, 0.7 times my age would be 0.77. And you come out with 70, if you wanted a range, say, I want to have them work within 77% of their heart rate max and 90% of their heart rate max, then you would come out with a calculation of around 148 to 174 if you use this. Right? If you are converting a program that you have found in a reputable journal or a reputable textbook or on a reputable website, right? And the training intensity is given in VO2, percentage VO2 max, they're not equivalent, all right? If you look at this graph, 50% VO2 max is 70% heart rate max. So you would have to do the transfer, right? You can't, if it's 50% VO2 max, you can't set them at 50% heart rate max. They'll be way under training, all right? So just be a little bit wary. Make sure that you're double checking what's the measure they're using before you set the percentage. Does that make sense? Right? So that one's really easy. Everybody can measure their heart rate. It's my favorite. Easy, cheap, anyone can do it. You can teach your PE children, you can teach your children at a rec center, you can teach your clients how to take their heart rate. It's easy, right? Heart rate monitors are relatively cheap now. Most people have a cell phone that is clever, and there are free apps that you can get where all you have to do is put your finger on the camera and it estimates your heart rate. So you don't even have to do a heart rate watch if you don't want to, right? So for me, this is just the out and out best measure because it's given the error within calculating heart rate max, your heart rate is very sensitive to how hard you're working. So it's a really good way of narrowing down your intensity to achieve the goal that you want for the exercise session. Okay, so percentage VO2 max would be a physiological measure, except that it's not available to us if we're just out on the track running around, okay? There is a method using your heart rate that estimates percentage VO2 max. So, if you don't want to go back to the graph and convert percentage VO2 max into percentage heart rate max, you can use the Carbonen method and keep your numbers as percentage VO2 max. Okay? So, heart rate reserve is calculated as your heart rate max minus your heart rate at rest. And then your target heart rate is then your heart rate at rest minus the percentage VO2 that you want to train at times your heart rate reserve. Okay? So if you look on page 386, there's a good example there of this calculation for you. I know it's 386 because I looked it up this morning. Where is it? There it is. All right. So if you're looking at a program that says they want you to work at 75% VO2 max, then you would put your heart rate at rest, so maybe 62, right? Minus 75 times whatever you've calculated your HRR to be. Does that make sense? And then that number that you come out with would be your heart rate that was necessary to work at 75% VO2 max. Okay? That means you have to calculate two numbers because you should never set a program with only one heart rate number, right? You should always give a range because for those of you that have good heart rate monitors, if you ever watch them while you're exercising, your heart rate fluctuates all the time, right? So you can't say to someone, I want you to work at 153 beats per minute, because it's impossible to keep it bang on 153 beats per minute, right? So you would want to give them a range of 148 to 160 or something like that, or 158, right? So that they're working within that range, and the average is going to be 153 or something like that, right? Because you just can't, it's too variable, beat to beat, okay? So always make sure that you calculate the range, and depending upon the person, the range may be bigger or tighter, depending how important it is that they're working at that intensity. Right? Question. Does that make sense? Yes?
Would your heart rate, would it like depend on like what you're doing? Like if you're like doing like weights compared to like running?
Probably. It depends what kind of weight program you're doing. If you're doing a traditional old-fashioned one where you're doing 8 reps and then taking a rest, your heart rate will go up quite quickly in the 8, but it will come down quite quickly over the rest. And so it will go up and down. If you're running, it's going to go up over the first 3 to 5 minutes. And then if you maintain the same speed, you don't hit any hills and you're running on a flat surface, you would go into what we call steady state. And at that point, your heart rate would remain pretty consistent until you either go faster or go up a hill. Okay? All right. Start trying to tie this idea back to our chapter 3 aerobic metabolism, right? Because heart rate goes up in order to deliver more oxygen to the muscle tissue so that we can make ATP. Okay. All right, this is a bit small, but RPE scales, RPE stands for ratings of perceived exertion. All right, So this is not a physiological measure because it's your perception of how hard you are working. Okay? There are several different versions. The classic Borg scale goes from number 6 to number 20. And so when you use an RPE scale, the idea is that you pick the number that you're going to work at. Okay? Now, because it's your perception of how hard you're working, you can't use it with beginners. All right? Because they don't understand yet how hard they're working. And they often over or underestimate, typically overestimate. They're like, oh my God, I'm dying. And you're like, your heart rate is 53, you're not dying. It's fine, right? So you can't use an RPE scale with someone who doesn't have a lot of experience at moving. I'm quite skeptical. However, I'm wrong because the research clearly shows that with people who know what they're doing, RPE scales are quite accurate at estimating their intensity, right? So you would be running and you're going to say, okay, I'm working pretty hard, I'm working around 14. Or I'm working very hard, I'm working at 17 or 18. Because you know whether you're working hard or not. And as I say, the research says it's very accurate. Pretty accurate. My problem is, I know if it was me, I would not be honest with myself about how hard I was working. I know I wouldn't. Right? I would find that really hard, whereas I can't make my heart rate lie. Right? My heart rate is what my heart rate monitor tells me it is. So I can't cheat if I'm using my heart rate monitor. I feel that me as an individual would cheat if I was given this. You know, and maybe not even deliberately, although I suspect deliberately. But, you know. So, it's not a bad measure of intensity, but it isn't a physiological measure of intensity because it's your perception of your exertion. Okay, so I would prefer for your log in class that you practice using a physiological measure of intensity. All right? Okay, the next way we can measure intensity is using METs. METs stands for metabolic equivalent. So because it's metabolic equivalent, it sounds like it's a physiological measure, all right? Except that really it isn't, because what you do is you say you're working at 3 METs, 4 METs, 5 METs, 6 METs. So it really isn't, because you don't take the physiological measure to calculate the METs that you're working at. All right? It's been quite popular recently in the research to use METs as a measure. I don't know, I haven't read the research enough to know how they were actually measuring it. So the MET is looking at the rate of oxygen consumption. Okay? So how much harder than sitting at rest are you working? All right? So 1 MET is how much oxygen I use to rest. 2 METs is twice that amount of oxygen, so I'm working 2 times harder. 3 METs is 3 times harder, etc. All right? The problem is I don't know how much oxygen I'm using when I'm sitting at rest, because I would need a VO2 cart to measure that. Right? So we come back to the situation where we have a number system that's based on me not knowing what my oxygen consumption is. So again, I could be wrong. A lot of people use this as an intensity measure. You see it quite a lot in training programs and in the research. But to me, I don't know how you would estimate that. Why use that when I can just take my actual heart rate and know exactly how hard I'm working, right? So, maybe I'm old-fashioned, I don't know. Excuse me. Excuse me, could you be quiet, please? All right. So there are some other problems to do with METs. As I said, the first one is obviously that different people's resting oxygen consumption can vary quite widely. All right. The next one is that how much oxygen I use to complete a skill or a task depends upon how skilled I am at the task. The more skilled I am, the less oxygen I use. Right? And the third one is that my oxygen consumption changes depending upon my environment and my hydration status. So that can skew the estimate of how hard I'm working as well. All right? None of those things impact heart rate. Because if I'm dehydrated, my heart rate goes up and tells me I'm working harder. Right? So I don't know. I don't get it. I think I'm just narrow-minded or something. I don't know. Anyway, so that's METs. I need to update this somewhat. Maybe I'll put that pen up, put it down, and use it. So I should add METs on here. Moderate is considered 3 to 6 METs, and vigorous is considered greater than 6. Yes.
So do none of these, like, I mean, I get obviously just looking at the equations, but do none of these take in, like, elevation into consideration or anything like that? Or would it even?
The physiological ones do. See, that's why I like them, because you can't get it wrong if you're measuring heart rate. If I'm at elevation, my heart rate is way higher than if I'm at sea level, period. And how hard I'm working depends upon the number of my heart rate. I don't have to change the number based on whether I'm at elevation or sea level. A good example, not that I'm power walking at the moment, but last year when I was power walking quite a lot, in the winter when it's cold, it's actually quite hard to get into my training zone because my heart rate I don't get warm. You know, it takes a long time to get my heart rate up into my training zone. In the summer, when it's 102 degrees, and I'm power walking, my heart rate is in my training zone within 3 minutes, right? And then I'm having to slow down all the time to keep it within my training zone. In the winter, I'm like, oh my God, I've got to go crazy to work hard enough to be in my training zone, right? So with METs, you'd have to be savvy enough to understand that piece of work you were doing at sea level that you might say was 4 METs is not 4 METs when you do it at altitude. But how do you know then what level? Do you see what I mean? I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like the most user-friendly way to be absolutely sure how hard I'm working. So this just gives us a comparison, right? So if I want to work in my moderate heart rate range, I'm looking at 60 to 79% of my heart rate max. If I'm working with VO2 max and I'm going to use heart rate reserve, I want to use 50 to 74 as my multiplication number in the equation, right here. This number would be 50 to 74. Right? Ratings of perceived exertion, if I want to work at a moderate level, I would be picking on that classic chart, the 6 to 21, would be 12 to 13. There are other charts, there's a 1 to 10 chart out there that you can find. Obviously then you've got a different number, right?
So is this the actual percentage we use in the evaluation?
This column would be the percentage that you would use here if you were using that heart rate reserve, yes. So you could pick the middle percentage, or you would do 2 equations. If you want them in that range, you do one equation here, get a heart rate number, do another equation using that, get another heart rate number, and that's their training range. Does that make sense? Because the number that I get out of this equation is my beats per minute in order to work at that percentage. Right? So we don't want to give just one, we want to give them a range. And again, depending on who the person is, you might not want to give them that big a range. You might want to tighten it up and say, I want them to work between 60 and 74. Or I want them to work between 58 and 70. Okay? Your textbook has one other measure, which is the talk test. All right? Clearly not physiological. All right? I wouldn't use it with anyone except an absolute beginner or someone who is severely overweight or obese. All right? The talk test is just literally that. Can they still hold a conversation while they're doing the work? Right? It's a nice, easy, risk-free measure for someone who has absolutely no idea what they're doing. Right? Or for someone who is so overweight that giving them an aerobic program, you know, you want to make sure they're not working very hard. Because you've got to get them, you may end up with clients who you literally have to get fit enough in order to give them a program. Right? Because they're in such bad shape or they're so overweight that they actually can't do even a minimal level program. Right? In that case, a talk test might be a, you know, if they're going to have a friend go with them, then a talk test might be a useful thing. Again, my preference would be to use this, because if I'm chatting with my friend, I'm not paying any attention to whether I'm walking quickly or whether I'm walking slowly. Right? So it wouldn't be my choice, personally. But when you're out there, you get to make their own choices as to what you use, right? You just want as many tools as possible in your toolkit so that you can manage the widest range of people who need help possible. And that's really the end goal. Do I have enough tools at my command that I can give anybody some help who wants to get healthier? Right. Any other questions? Okay, so remember the goal for the physical activity log is to be looking at the DHHS guidelines for moderate and vigorous activity. It does not have to be exercise. It has to be activity. So if you click on the link that is in the document, you'll see that there are many things that can be counted as physical activity, which we would not consider sport or exercise. Right? So you don't have to narrow it down to just, well, I don't have time to do a 30-minute run today. Right? That's not the point. I want you to think outside the box, because when you go out to work, you may not be dealing with competitive athletes. Right? And not everybody wants to go for a run or ride their bike or go to a weight room. You've got to be able to be flexible about other ways that they could do physical activity that would get them healthy. All right? And it's difficult when you're a competitive athlete, right? You're so automated into this, my exercise plan. And that's, if I didn't do 30 minutes today, then I didn't exercise today. Well, that's not necessarily true. Okay? All right. See you tomorrow.